Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Always glad to be here.
Welcome, welcome. But the news is not so good in terms of we'll be coming out to the other topics. But first, even in terms of Minneapolis school shooting, yet another shooting, what do we know of this? How should we understand? And strangely, the shooter seems to be calling for nuking India. Is that right? Means tell us what is the India connection here also. So help us understand what's happening down there in Minneapolis school shooting.
It's a very strange story indeed. The shooter's mother apparently works at the Catholic school where the shooting occurred. It killed two children, wounded at least 17. Some reports are putting the number of killed at 3. And this is the second Catholic school shooting within days in the same area. Now, interestingly enough, the shooter was actually posting a lot on social media, basically boasting about his plans for a month before the incident occurred. I'll get into why the security services took no action, but let's discuss the shooter himself, or rather, I don't even know what pronouns to give this person, because apparently the shooter, who was born male, was transgender, identified as a female, horribly anti-Semitic, had quoted Hitler, was had the in some ways could be described as a radical leftist, but in other ways it's not so clear, because some of the patches that he had were in Russian. They were pro FSB. He also had the patches calling for nuking India. Interestingly enough, he also had a letter or journal entry which was written in English but in Russian letters. And interestingly enough, they were written in the phonetic spelling, the way somebody who's who's a native Russian speaker would pronounce English words. So all of that is very odd. Where and how he would learn Cyrillic alphabet um, is not clear. But his profile, this very confused amalgamation of ideologies in extremist traits, is similar to the profile of two people. One he admired, which was Breivik, the mass murderer in Norway, who's serving a life sentence, who had a Z, which is a name associated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, carved out on his hair, the way his hair was shaped when he went to trial. The other profile that this reminds me of is the Christchurch killer in New Zealand, an individual who went into a mosque and killed over 50 people. He did not have a clear profile other than having traveled to various places for training, including North Korea, Iran. He had Armenian and Russian signs on his gun. It was, he's been to the various Middle Eastern countries, also Jordan, I believe. He's trained in some of these places, trained how to shoot, got some sort of paramilitary training, um, and also had so he had this very miscellaneous mix of different international extremist connections. um, it doesn't it seems that the ideology there sympathetic to assorted ultra-nationalist streams or white supremacist streams, but these individuals, or at least the Christchurch killer, had no compulsion of dealing with non-white groups. He killed Muslims and yet had gone to Iran for training, for instance, and he seemed to not like he seemed to be white supremacist, but didn't mind getting training from North Korea and so forth. So all of that is very bizarre, but it seems to me that this sort of nihilistic generalized violence that clearly cherry picks victims but has no compulsion of making alliances of convenience with anyone who can provide training, resources, and inspiration seems to be the new emerging model of the so-called lone wolf terrorists. I hesitate to actually really call them lone wolf because in the Christchurch killer's case, at least, we know that he had worked with various extremists in different countries and received training, and who knows, maybe even was encouraged to engage in mass violence, in acts of mass violence. So just because his act was presumably planned and carried out on his own doesn't mean that he hadn't operated within a context of cooperation with other people, perhaps even a full-blown conspiracy. Uh, with with the Massachusetts shooter, it's less clear. We don't know that he was necessarily um, that he had any sort of formal arrangements with anybody, but it is clear that he had an admiration for the methods of Russia. And what we also know is that Russia has also been encouraging these sort of individuals who are probably mentally unbalanced and pushing them over the edge and encouraging them and providing information online and elsewhere and providing trolls and bots who may have engaged with such people and study their psychological profile and encourage them for the sake of causing chaos. Now, regarding the India, nuking India, um, this is really, really odd and it seems to be random, but not if you consider that what kind of groups this individual was involved in. If he operated within the network of possibly white conspiracists, possibly neo-communist associations, perhaps with some background linking him not only to Russia to China, it may very well be that they encourage him to use patches and use the sort of messaging that spoke to their own agenda. Whether or not he really thought about what any of that really meant is not clear. But we do know that he fantasized about violence for at least a month, that he had a personal connection to that school, and he also had he was deeply uncomfortable with his own identity, which is why he um, was undergoing transgender sort of treatment, or at least identity. It's not, I don't know the details of just how far he had actually gone in the process. As I said, I'm not entirely sure that this is really a lone wolf attack. What I do know is that there was a clear failure to detect his activity. Now, going back to the security context of all of this, it appears that this is not the first such incidents whether the FBI or the local authorities dropped the ball in preventing and identifying an individual with clear red flags who operated online. And admittedly, out of all mentally imbalanced, fabulous operating on social media, it is hard to keep track of everyone and figure out which ones are serious and which ones are just talking trash to impress their friends and community. But what is clear is that within the last few months, there's been a serious cut in services and federal services that would be dealing with domestic extremism. The entire department dealing with domestic terrorism, for instance, was recently eliminated. And a 22-year-old individual who was appointed by Trump in charge of this domestic terrorism, one of the domestic terrorism programs, eliminated 75% of his department in the months preceding this incident. So while we don't know whether, without any of these factors, having somebody who was not 22 years old, whose prior job to taking this senior position would have been something other than being a gardener, for instance, whether such a, whether such an individual would have definitively prevented this disaster, we do know that all of these factors certainly didn't help, and they don't inspire confidence that the U.S. government has the resources and the framework necessary to prevent future incidents after this one. This individual was obviously obsessed with other mass killers. Clearly, the publicity that such people gain affects people who are already on edge, who are already mentally unstable, who already have violent fantasies, and who already are perhaps operating in a social media environment that is conducive to these fantasies. There's been stories about networks that recruit teenagers and young people and into neo-Nazi satanic cults that are not necessarily really ideological as they're into shock value and nihilism and in general devaluation of human life and targeting of specific groups and this sort of demonstrative performative violence. So we may be dealing with a case that could be classified along those lines. But again, I'd like to stress that it's very concerning that the rise in these profiles of these very disturbed young people with body dysmorphia, with identity issues, and with the general tendency towards violence and obsessiveness and very unhealthy associations, and also inspired by international recruitment activity of some sort, that this profile has not led to a more careful um, evaluation of the sort of mental health assistance and disruptive, preventative, prophylactic um, activity that whether the social services or the law enforcement in the US and other countries are providing to people who are likely to be who are likely to end up in going in that direction. And I think the red flags for such people come out a lot earlier than most people realize. And I think professionals can detect the fact that somebody is disturbed, uncomfortable, socially isolated, and has very unhealthy, obsessive mental tendencies, and should be receiving therapy or some sort of treatment and further evaluation. Those things I think are fairly easy to detect. I think a lot of these people are not simply socially awkward, but have this, but are demonstratively so. And the more the younger generations become open on social media, the easier it is to detect when somebody is posting obsessively and in a way that's clearly unhealthy.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, are they treating it, or can we call it a terrorist attack or something from someone who is mentally, disturbed in some way or the other because of whatever reasons? Because here is, or is it that somebody used that situation, or is it he acted out on his own? But then he must have left clues before also. How suddenly a mentally disturbed person suddenly becomes more open, especially during the time of attack, and think about or write about things or represent things which he or she did not represent earlier on.
Well, the incident is being treated as a domestic terrorism case and as a hate crime by the FBI. Kash Patel came out with a statement, Still, there's a lot more questions than answers at this point. I do think that his psychotic fantasies were not just incidental. I think there was something leading up to this incident. It might have had to do with some external stimulation that led him to become more committed to this carrying this fantasy into real life. And it may have been the fact that he was associating with somebody who was either directly encouraging him or indirectly leading him towards this path through playing on his existing fantasies, obsessions. There are signs of psychotic um, tendencies in his structure of thought and his fantasies, but that doesn't mean that the operation wasn't planned, that he was completely incoherent, or that he didn't know that what he was doing was wrong or could have brought him problems. In fact, some may argue that the fact that he was fantasizing about it so publicly is not just an issue of narcissistic boasting, but also an attempt to draw attention and to be stopped before before he crossed that line. Um, Regardless of that, there's a lot to be investigated here, and it's also a fact that there's been a concern that schools do not have sufficient protection from random shooters entering the facilities and being able to attack young children and faculty, and there's no serious security to stop someone like that before he causes a serious injury. The fact that there were two incidents at two Catholic schools in such a short span does make me wonder whether the other incident, which drew far less attention and was in fact barely mentioned in the media, whether there was some higher level coordination, not necessarily between the individuals executing those acts, but whoever may have been handling them or encouraging them, whether they had in fact gained control of more than one mentally disturbed and easily manipulable individuals and tried to organize a series of incidents in close proximity for whatever reason. I don't know if that's the case, but it's certainly worth looking into at the very least.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll have to watch out for more details coming on to this case. Let's move on to another thing that happened sometime, a few days back, but the Alaska summit takeaways. What are there any takeaways at all from the Alaska summit, Irina? Because there was a lot of talk, a lot of things that that could be expected. Wanted to feel the in to understand the situation. What should we understand? What actually happened? It happened, but what happened?
Well, my big takeaway from this is that the wrong Russia expert was fired. As you know, days after this incident, after the summit, Gabbard fired one of the top CIA Russia analysts. But I don't think that analyst had anything to do with the summit. I think the summit was pushed by Steve Witkoff, who misrepresented the nature of Putin's comments to Trump. From my understanding, Putin's visit to Moscow resulted in Putin expressing an interest in meeting the US president, but as John Bolton later wrote in his article, this was a Guinness record level of expeditiousness in going from Putin's express wish to execution. So there were no intermediary steps. Even though Putin didn't make any concessions or promise anything concrete, only made demands, it seems that Vitkov misunderstood his message. I believe Vitkov seems to have thought that the summit had something to do with a land swap that Russia would be returning some territories in exchange from Ukraine. In that swap would have only worked had Ukraine retained control of Kursk, which it had at one point invaded. But let's recall that US had done away with that leverage by um, essentially freezing the support to Ukraine at a critical point. That offensive collapsed, and now Ukraine had no more leverage that they could use for a successful exchange of territories. Instead, Russia made unilateral demands which didn't make any sense, uh, and were also unconstitutional from Ukraine's point of view. It seems that Trump nevertheless adopted Putin's position. Putin refused to commit to a ceasefire and, in fact, continued firing and striking at civilians before, during, and after the summit. And all of that was in no way conducive to a message of peace. He also conducted a cyber attack on U.S. Federal court system days before this. The Russian media had had come out with a statement. The state media, not just regular Russian media, essentially calling for elimination of all Ukrainians, which is a shows genocidal intent. Trump did not call Putin out on any of these things during the summit, nor about the mass abduction of Ukrainian civilians, including children, tens of thousands of children, among hundreds of thousands of civilians that had disappeared. And of course, without a ceasefire, there's no good reason for Ukraine to commit to negotiations. Uh, Trump nevertheless pushed for going straight to final peace talks without getting any ceasefire from Ukraine. Rubio and Trump promised NATO like Article 5 commitments. What that means, nobody knows, because Article 5 has not been tested in this particular setting. In the setting of conventional confrontations. Yes, in the past, European and other allies had supported the United States in its war on terrorism, but it was asymmetrical operations and not full scale response to a state actor. Um, so, what we are seeing is a very strange scenario with which Putin essentially walks away with a propaganda victory from coming to the United States, shaking hands with the U.S. president, who does not challenge him on any of the controversies and security issues, and who adopts his position unilaterally, who then proceeds to blame Zelensky for the war and misrepresent the war as being in equal measure the fault of two countries, whereas there was a very clear violation of international law by Russia. The summit in Washington with Zelensky and the Europeans passed without any incidents, probably because Europeans presented a united front with Ukraine and prevented a new ambush, but it also did not resolve in any change of position by Trump or any serious commitments to Ukraine's defense. For instance, the air support that they desperately need has not materialized. In fact, as we learned, Pentagon has banned Ukraine from utilizing long-range missiles uh, in attacking Russia, despite Trump's words that without offensive operations, Ukraine cannot win. So he is essentially admitting that Russia is attacking strategically important lands, prime real estate, as he described. He he admitted that offensive operations are necessary to push Russian forces out of Ukraine at the very least and to deter them from future attacks, because Russia's agreements on paper are literally not worth the paper they're printed on. But at the same time, he said that Ukraine should basically agree to lose the war without any concessions from Russia, which is not a position any head of state would accept. And when Zelensky also did not accept that, and when the Europeans pushed for a ceasefire before the peace talks, Trump took it as an opportunity to attack Zelensky and essentially blame him for refusing to be reasonable and compromise on these issues. So this has been a protracted execution of the same thing that we have seen time and again since Trump took office. Moreover, Trump, after trying to push Putin and Zelensky to meet together and having failed to secure concrete arrangements, claimed that he would wait a couple more weeks before imposing sanctions and tariffs on anybody, but he didn't say who'd be facing those sanctions and tariffs. And in all likelihood, I don't see that Russia will face any serious additional consequences besides a continuing attempts to be brought to the table.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, why meeting with Zelensky shortly after meeting Putin in Alaska? Means, who was this message for? Was it for Zelensky that you are still welcome? Was it for Putin that you are? I also talked with Zelensky. How should one understand? And this time Zelensky was in a proper, formal suit and tie. So this time I guess everyone must be happy. And he was his usual self to a journalist in that journalist pool. He told that you haven't changed, but I changed, but you did not. So I not to put Zelensky was his himself, but in terms of the takeaways, what was the takeaway? Means for a person sitting in this part of the world, why did this happen? Was it required, or was it again some sort of a posturing by the White House?
Well, I have to say, Zelensky, to his credit, managed to keep everyone happy because he also did not dispose of his uniform, he just added to it. So he was able to do what he wanted to do and at the same time not face any criticism from the administration and preempt any efforts in that regard. More interestingly to note regarding the media pool and those journalists, many of them had already had pro-Russian positions, and yet they were able to get multiple questions in during the press interview. By the way, the Putin-Trump summit did not allow for any questions. But during Zelensky's intervention, there were multiple rounds of questions, and several journalists with clear Russian or pro-Russian positions got to ask at least 4 questions each, which is very unusual, and which indicates that the media pool was sort of a setup by Trump and his team. Still, while the optics were better than the February fiasco, the outcomes nevertheless did not amount to anything concrete. Nobody walked away with anything other than expressing their position. Yes, it's positive that Trump, Zelensky, and the Europeans did not get into a massive brawl, but the fact that this is the low bar we're now expecting from the U.S. president and his closest allies is not is not anything to boast about. Unfortunately, what we did not see is a committed U.S. response to, at the very least, confront Russia, if not support Ukraine, and to challenge Russia on its grotesque human rights violations, mass atrocities regarding Ukrainian civilians, and also attacks on the United States, which, by the way, continued after all of this. We have seen multiple confrontations in near Alaska and now near Norway with ships being harassed and airplanes and ships being harassed. So, what was the message there? It was very simple. Trump was trying to get to a deal as quickly as possible, unaware that the very fact that he did not invite Zelensky to the initial summit with Putin undercut Ukraine's position and made negoti- constructive negotiations much less likely because Putin took the signal as this being an arrangement between Russia and the US, not Russia and Ukraine. And since then, the foreign minister Lavrov has expressed on multiple occasions that Zelensky is not a legitimate president of Ukraine, and that therefore Russia does not feel compelled to engage in negotiations with him. Uh, this is also uh, uh, it's also worth noting that Russia throughout this time continued putting out various propaganda. Its messaging has not changed regarding Ukraine. And it's very clear that it took Trump's position as sympathetic to its own cause and felt the freedom to continue these attacks. Trump was rushing into diplomacy for his own benefit. He felt pressured to deliver results. After promising to end the war in 24 hours, he wanted to get close to a Nobel Peace Prize, not realizing that his strategy was doomed to failure from the very beginning. And he also was rushing towards business deals because, as we now know, there was a secret arrangement between ExxonMobil and the Russian counterparts for believe it or not, a return of ExxonMobil to Russia. Now, the irony in all of this, by the way, is that just as US is willing to circumvent its own sanctions on Russian oil and to return ExxonMobil without initially going through the procedure of lifting those sanctions on Russia to return them to Russia, the tariffs on India for buying Russian oil just went into effect, and they are quite calamitous in likely destroying the profit margins for Indian exporters, and not just energy exporters, but exporters of anything to the United States. So I don't know how anyone else is reading it, but to me, it's made very clear that none of what's going on is really about Russian oil. It's about um, potentially secret arrangements that Trump has made with particular countries. Initially, many people thought that he was picking on India because India is dependent on the US markets and it's easy to push around. But having failed to exert similar pressure on China, which is a much bigger um, purchaser of Russian oil, especially recently, and um, having failed to do the same to Saudi Arabia, which is also purchasing Russian oil and moreover reselling it by mixing it with other types of oil from other countries. It's very obvious that this is not just about Trump's comfort level and or even making money. There's something more going on in the background. There is a political message here, and not just an issue of Trump, realizing that U.S. is dependent economically on China, and this would cause a lot of damage. We're seeing this because Trump reversed his position on letting in Chinese students. Rubio previously made a statement that these visas were going to be reviewed and potentially taken away. Now Trump is saying that 600,000 Chinese students would be allowed into the United States. That's a huge number, especially given that US is now committed to vetting all 55 million legal visas in the US. Vetting those additional 600,000 students is going to be a near impossible task. So I suspect there's some financial back dealing with China in the background, that China has maybe paid some lump sum for allowing this policy to proceed. There may be also a concerted deal with China regarding US leaving aside its entire Indo-Pacific strategy. What US is getting out of it, I have no idea, and whether it's anything that's even um, related to US interests or the Trump organization's business interests or Trump personally is also unclear. But to me, it's becoming obvious that what Trump has done completely undermines his own grand strategy of connecting India, Middle East, and Europe, and building those connections, of building relationship with India up as a counter to China's economic and security hegemony. And it's also going to undercut not only the relationship with India, but anyone else who has any remaining trust in long-term relations with the United States, because after what happened with a very significant global player, an increasingly global player, smaller countries have even less to hope for in that regard.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. We thought that, this 50% tariffs, somehow something will happen, some talks will succeed, and this will not happen. But this has come into effect now. Do you think this is almost like antagonizing a lot of the Indians? Because this is now trade. Earlier in 1971, the US role people have not forgotten in India, and that is why they are, much more thinking of Russia much more positively because of that role. Again, this time, with a lot of livelihoods getting impacted as much as 50-60% with these draconian tariffs, if we call it, uh, do you think this is going to be a long-term damage? Because people will again not forget what, even if Trump goes away after his 4-year term, people will think US cannot be trusted in any way. And this time it's people who are getting hurt because straight away onto their stomachs. A lot of people doing a lot of exports are also from very, very middle class, small factories, very much dependent on this sort of a trade.
I just think that Trump is doing a lot of damage. I don't think that damage is reversible. The way to rebuild US trust in that regard will be up to US Congress and future administrations by putting measures in place which will make it very difficult for any executive to usurp so much power and to engage in this type of tariff or punitive measures without a very extensive process and very concrete measures that correlate to specific actions. In other words, what Trump is doing is basically running roughshod over existing frameworks. He's abusing power, arguably, and Congress is giving up its power in a way that is arguably unconstitutional in that regard. So restoring these legal functions and enforcing them will be a way to overcome distrust into personalities abusing the process. US used to pride itself on being the country of laws, not of men. And it was its constitution that made the country great because no matter the mistakes of any particular president or member of Congress or some official, you could be counted on correcting the course by returning to that legal and framework to enforce US interests. That has been deeply damaged, not just by Trump, but the preceding executives and Congress over time, but it can be and has to be restored, not just for the sake of relationships with other countries, but for the sake of basic law and order in the United States, if US is to survive as in its current form. So that is going to have to happen eventually. I don't know what will happen with the next US president, but this is the steps to restoring the trust. This is what it's going to take to show a very committed and transparent process to restoring these safeguards that have kept US, despite its various political upheavals and mistakes and controversies, still it managed to maintain leadership, respect, and relations with countries even through various different difficulties in time. Trump i- is disregarding all of that, and it's not just with India. We have seen his reversal of information sharing with the Five Eyes, who are the closest allies that the United States has. And that's damaging more to the United States than to those countries because at the end of the day, they can find that intelligence in some other way. But US is now losing the trust of four different states that have contributed significantly to common security and intelligence sharing frameworks. So this is systematic. It's not just about India. We are seeing this sort of damage happen in many various directions. I'm not saying that Indians should take comfort in that, but at the very least, it's not some massive anti-Indian backlash inside the United States. It's Trump asserting uh, acting like organized crime in power rather than a US president. That does not reflect necessarily on most people who don't even understand how those tariffs are imposed or for what reason and cannot be held necessarily accountable for all of that, especially after Trump essentially gaslit the country on how he was going to manage those tariffs and what would be the outcome. I don't think most people are economic experts, nor do they necessarily follow all of this. So, on a popular level, I think it's important not only to wait for things to get back to some sort of normal, but it's important to remember that this is not a US anti-Indian issue. It's a Trump issue, and not just towards India, but towards many important and close allies. But on a popular level, it's important to maintain as good relations as possible, because it actually makes it more likely that Americans will come to their senses. They will not want to sacrifice business relationships, professional relationships, friendships, um, for the sake of appeasing Trump and his ego or his personal interests. At the end of the day, people care about their own interests more than anything else, and they will see themselves losing profit from losing business. And those who have done and have been growing their business in India and unfortunately have to face the brunt of this backlash, they understand that this is not a course that is worth pursuing, but they are not empowered to do anything other than voting in the future elections or writing about it in op-eds, and which some people are already doing anyway. So at the end of the day, this should be not be seen as a measure by all Americans against India. Um, any outrage should be directed to where it belongs, which is the decision makers in power, and not regular American people, many of whom are deeply regretful that this is the direction is going. I think overall, the popular opinion in the US has not been anti Indian at all. On the contrary, a growing number of people understood its strategic value vis a vis China, not to mention were enjoyed travel, enjoy food, enjoy personal relationships with the via the Indian American community. So burning those bridges is not going to help. It's going to hurt, and it's going to empower people like Trump who are looking for this sort of isolation and polarization, and who are looking to burn those bridges and make Americans more dependent on the executive. Because if they lose those bridges to the outside world, they will have no one to turn to but Trump himself. And this is part of the calculus. And this is what the Indian government and the Indians themselves should remember. They should not be playing into Trump's or China's, for that matter, strategy in that regard. I do deeply suspect that China is somehow involved in motivating this course of action. Obviously, I can only speculate, but it would make sense logically. China is the number one beneficiary, as is Russia. India has been turning away from Russia in many respects, not just with diversifying defense, but also purchasing oil and gas from other places, also turning towards stronger collaborations with the West. Of course, the Quad strategy inevitably would have affected Russia's collaborations with China. So all of these things are obviously designed to undercut a very strategic and growing relationship. And unfortunately, right now everything the signs are that it's been quite effective. One can only hope that India will not allow um, uh, this arrangement where it's being sold to China and Russia to continue, but rather will assert its independence, build up stronger relations in Africa with the European Union, with the Middle Eastern countries, and not play into this trilateral arrangement, which obviously doesn't help anybody at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. Talking of India, China, and also India, Russia, we will come to that. But first, staying with this itself, what about the choice of nomination of the U.S. ambassador? How do you see that part? How should Indian understand this part also?
Now, this particular individual has been hugely controversial in the United States, and this is something that I don't know if how many people externally are aware of. This person was previously in charge of the entire hiring process for the executive branch, which is a huge responsibility, makes him one of the key officials in the United States. So, if you had, under normal circumstances, if someone like that were to be nominated for the position of ambassadors, that would have made him a very important person in the president's network, and it would have strengthened the relationship with the US. But aside from the general geopolitical situation with the tariffs, it gets more complicated because Sergio Gore is not really Sergio Gore. His name is actually Sergei Govorokhin. He is of Russian ethnic descent, born in Central Asia. He changed his name. He acquired Maltese uh, citizenship, and Malta is a place known for Russian and Qatari operations. It essentially has become a front for Russian and Qatari businesses and operatives. This individual concealed his background, his identity as someone of former Soviet extraction, lied about it to the public, and not only has he banned the FBI from investigating other nominees, creating a very serious security issue and conflict of interest, he himself did not go through the appropriate vetting procedures, raising a lot of questions. Now, if somebody like that is being nominated for the ambassador, even if India has very friendly public relations with Russia, I would have, if I were the prime minister, I would have had a lot of questions about why a person who lied to his own government, who has a very murky role in the U.S., what what would be his role in India, and what would he be doing and for whom, and why no transparency? Heck, if he wants to say he's from, he is Russian with a pro-Russian position, that would not make him the first or the last such individual in Trump's radar. But at least he would know exactly where he stands and what his positions are. The fact that he's operating covertly raises questions about his agenda and how he would operate in his position and who his real loyalties are to. And that is not a position you want a senior diplomat to have. This is not a role for an ambassador. That's maybe a role for some, secret clandestine operative operating out of a listening station, not for a public face of the State Department. And that is
Absolutely.
why I think there should be a very critical overview of his candidacy before he's credentialed in India, in my opinion. Not because not because he has Russian sympathies or a background in former Soviet Union, but because he's a liar.
Right, right. So now coming to the India, US and India, Russia and India, China relations. So Foreign Minister Jaishankar's visit to Russia. How do we look at that particular thing? And also, the SCO upcoming SCO summit in China, India, China relations. Will it get a new start here? About India-Russia relations with lot of different aspects of Russia in different things also being talked about. How do you see it all going? Do you think Indian diplomats are also not understanding everything? How are they managing all this? How do you see this in the coming up in the future?
Obviously, what happened has been a gift for Russia because Russia has already had a lot of connections inside India. Not necessarily at the top level of government, but everywhere else. It's easy for Russia to infiltrate, to build on prior existing relationships, and to activate them when the right time is afoot. So this means that pro-Russian media networks are activating to mobilize the population, the street in India, to play on kind of the nationalist card against the insult from the United States and create this very emotional pressure on the government. And even if the government is not necessarily disposed to embrace Russia and its promises 100%, there is a pressure to be seen as doing something, as balancing the relationship with the US, as sending very clear signals. There's been, for instance, a report from a German publication claiming that Trump personally had tried to call Prime Minister Modi 4 times within the last month, and the phone was not picked up. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the fact that this is even being reported is a sign that at the very least, this is a kind of message that somebody somewhere wants to get out. That the relationship between India and the United States at the top level is not going very well. And regardless of whether this report is accurate or not, the public value for Russia is that they're able to see that US is weakened, that India is losing support in the Western world, and therefore it has no choice but to revert back to its old relations. So this is also, I wouldn't be surprised if this sort of a leak is not necessarily by India but by Russia, specifically to aggravate the situation even more, to cause embarrassment to both sides, and to send a message to Indians that they have no friends but their old network of supporters in Russia. Now, Foreign Minister Jaishankar's visit should not be seen as an isolated incident. Of course, there's been prior high-level visits between the two countries. They have, after all, they've had long-standing relations. Prime Minister Modi not so long ago visited Russia himself. But this should be seen as a part of a series of escalating contacts between the Putin government and India, because we have seen multiple phone calls at the top level, including right after the Alaska summit. We are seeing that Putin is planning to come to India. There's been leaks from the Ukrainian intelligence about planned defense frameworks, strengthening defense between the two countries. And as a matter of fact, the visit was actually about that, all about bilateral contacts, both in terms of trade and, of course, in terms of defense. And we're not talking about just about ongoing trade or purchasing some more additional weapons. We're talking about strategic realignment, which is much more serious than some additional trade deals. And this is a concern because U.S. should be seeing it as a potential obstacle to its own security considerations. After all, Russia is looking at India as a nearly infinite pool of resources to draw from: natural resources, human resources, intelligence, security cooperation, intelligence gathering. This is not what US should want to happen, because in addition to simply losing the opportunities with India, which is bad enough as it is now giving very significant leverage to adversarial powers in potentially utilizing those resources against the United States and its allies. Um, so this sort of cooperation is never just because in the current context it's obviously representing a shift back towards the Russia, China, Iran, North Korea axis, not the kind of relationship that anyone would have. Certainly, it will strengthen the BRICS network that Trump had seen as an economic threat to his own interests. And of course, we are seeing the first preview of all of that in Prime Minister Modi's visit to China that's coming up this weekend, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference. Of course, India has been a member for a while, but it's the top level visit to China since 2018. It's the first in a long time, at least, such high level visit to that particular summit. It's clearly going to be a summit with an specifically anti-American agenda as delineated by Putin's president. The fact that all three of them are going to be present at this summit is a strong strategic messaging. And of course, substantive discussions are also going to take place in the background, even if they're not fully reported. So this is a clear pivot point. This is a pivot point that's going to be very difficult to reverse from unless there are clear steps taken towards de-escalating this situation very quickly. And it's a very strategic point towards which uh, which countries, which blocks, which security arrangements are going to be emerging in the near future. Up until recently, India was growing its cooperation with the West in the Indo-Pacific. It clearly was opposed to China's operations in that area. Now we're going to see likely something quite different. We will see increased cooperation in the defense issues, and not just in terms of trade. We are seeing the restoration of visas for the first time since in 5 years. Not just visas, but flights, direct flights. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, there's a talk of even restoring TikTok, which was banned in 20 a few years ago as a propaganda tool for very correct reasons. Now, admittedly, US is not even banning TikTok. It was banned by Congress, but Trump is violating the law and keeps giving China both a tariff and a TikTok lifeline, which only underscores the question that there are some political, professional, personal, business conflicts of interest afoot. Unfortunately, none of that is helpful to understanding where it's all heading for the average American. And for the average American, it does not look very good to have even more people around the world becoming indoctrinated through TikTok propaganda, which is very anti-American. Also, by the way, anti-Israel a lot of the time, um, exporting extremist content, just as India and the US had been reestablishing and strengthening counterterrorism, counter-extremism, security relations. This is not going to be helpful to that at all either.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking of TikTok, yes, I'm still trying to understand. A lot of Indian media also reported on it, almost like it's going to open up again. And a lot of people are like, oh, very hopeful. But I don't see, I haven't read anything beyond that. So I'm just trying to understand, is it just some, a lot of background diplomacy going on, or is it some testing of waters, or is it just like another rumor that has gotten a bit too far?
I do think that this is a test balloon for a policy that is understandably controversial, but it could be part of trust building measures with China and also a message to the United States. The problem is, it would be a message to the US if Trump had actually been opposed to TikTok. But Trump has reversed himself, just as he has reversed himself on practically everything, including, as I mentioned, the entire Indo Pacific strategy up until this point, which means that none of the strategic messaging by India or anybody else should be geared towards Trump. Trump can change his mind at a moment's notice on anything, even if that original policy is in the US national interest. So I suggest that a better framework is to look at the long-term impact, first of all, for India's own interests, and I don't think they're well served by restoring TikTok. The only party that would gain from that would be China. If India does not want to rely on American Snapchat or others that have replaced TikTok because of the tensions with Trump, they can develop their own or import European alternatives or Middle Eastern alternatives. They should not just be taking adversarial propaganda tool and disseminating it. It's not going to be serving their own interests regardless of Trump or no Trump. And Trump doesn't actually care because he is using that tool himself. So that would not help at all. I also don't think that rushing towards China just because of temporary tensions with the US is not necessarily an ideal scenario, because if this growing relationship can crumble so quickly over the admittedly dramatic and painful actions by one individuals, how much are they really worth if you're basing it on one erratic person and his coterie of cronies rather than national interests that should transcend individual administrations? If you're operating under pressure from your own enemies, then your policy is going to be easily manipulated by third parties, and you will not be able to build up long-term positive frameworks with anyone really. So I think that there is a difference between sending strategic messages, look, we've got other options, or we need to replace our economic losses somehow, and fully turning in the direction and serving the aims of those adversaries, which still cannot be trusted, even if they're behaving more rationally and are using charm offensive to take advantage of the current situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's talk about, Gaza. Gaza and ceasefire. We have heard this many times. Many times it has happened. And this time, again, it did not stay. Again, this time we are hearing these two words together again. Gaza ceasefire. What is happening? What does it look like? Again, it will be another addition to the past history of ceasefires.
Well, that discussion ended almost as quickly as it began. The Hamas proposal was not presented before the Knesset in Israel, and Israel went ahead with broadening its offensive in Gaza. Allegedly, many people are now relocating from Gaza City to other areas of Gaza, while Hamas is trying to prevent them from leaving, even if it means that they would be doomed to injury or death from the airstrikes and other confrontations. We have seen that once again, Hamas operatives under journalistic cover and in other capacities had infiltrated a hospital which was attacked by Israel. Unfortunately, some civilians died alongside those terrorists, and as usual, the optics did not favor Israel. There are now serious discussions about the day after on the US side. Israel still has not proposed a clear plan. Israel officials have tried reaching out to South Sudan to discuss potential relocations of Gazans who want to leave Gaza, but it's not a good idea for many reasons, one of which is a cholera outbreak in South Sudan, meaning bringing in Gazans will not serve either South Sudan or Gazans well. I expect that it would be a complete disaster. Also, Gazans in a Christian majority country would not necessarily um, do very well, and the other way around. I don't think it's a good combination. Um, so far, those talks have not ended with anything for fairly obvious and predictable reasons. But today, the President Trump chaired a meeting about Gaza and the day after and humanitarian issues. Tony Blair, among other people, was pitching plans for reconstruction of Gaza. I have to warn all these people that reconstructing the infrastructure in Gaza will be the easiest um, part of the day after. The hardest part is securing Gaza enough that those reconstruction plans are not sabotaged almost immediately by infighting among various factions and terrorist groups that will emerge. And this is the part where no one has any clear idea. Now, the one party that is attempting to take a more proactive measure is Egypt, which is training Palestinian forces to take on Gaza after the day after. But the problem is, if those Palestinian forces are from West Bank, they are likely to clash significantly with the Gazans because culturally and politically those two areas are very different and are at odds with each other. Even if Gazans don't like Hamas anymore, they are not. That doesn't mean that they will like the Egyptian-trained West Bank police or law enforcement or military any better. If, on the other hand, these people are Gazans, it's unclear how much Egypt can actually trust them to not try to bring Hamas back to power. So we are left with more questions than answers, and there's no clear coordination between different parties. The French and the Saudis are still trying to push the recognition of Palestine while also simultaneously trying to push Hamas out of power, politically speaking. There's a growing consensus that Hamas is not popular in Gaza anymore and also not good. But there is also blind spots among European leadership about the fact that a state that is ideologically hostile to Israel is not going to be any better for Israel than a non state actor with the same ideological framework. I think this is a a mistake built, brought to the same people who have educated students of the international order that democracy without liberal values and civil institutions is worth all that much process for the sake of process and so forth. Creating a state with a vote at the UN and other international institutions, with the military, with significant channels for support that is hateful and ideologically extreme, is actually more dangerous, not less dangerous, than having a non-state entity, because it gives that state powers that a non-state entity will simply not have. And I think this is what President Macron and others fail to understand. Gaza will not automatically transform into UAE or any other, relatively developed Middle Eastern country just by giving it statehood and, creating some nominal government. It will take a generation to and very concerted effort to de-radicalize the population so it can actually coexist. And the government there will need to have the willpower to A, not get ousted quickly, and B, actually maintain the sort of commitment to peace that Egypt, despite popular hostility to Israel, has maintained for all these decades, even under the Muslim Brotherhood.
Absolutely, absolutely. And from Gaza, let's move on to Saudi Arabia. There, what is happening with this Saudi intel leak? How should we understand? Means a lot of this stuff going online all of a sudden.
Yeah, so this is actually a crazy situation. Apparently, the entire contents of the Saudi external intelligence service uh, has been leaked to a paid database that is accessible by professionals and also by people who are willing to pay the price of access. What I think is going to happen next is that information is going to be sold off and some of it will leak for free in various ways. I think it's just a matter of time. I think at first they're going to sell that intelligence off to the highest bidder, whoever is running that platform, and eventually some of it will be leaked for free to the general audiences or accessible for lower prices, in some frameworks. What that means, however, for Saudi Arabia is very serious. First of all, it's if this is all accurate, this is the worst security breach they have had ever. Second, it means that most likely it was facilitated by insiders, either useful idiots who had complete lack of situational awareness and were easily manipulated by hackers, or by traders of some sort who had arrangements with those third parties, or some combination of both. I don't think this is due to lack of technical capabilities, because I know for a fact that Saudi Arabia has invested quite heavily in some of the top of the line cybersecurity programs. So it's not for the lack of resources or for the lack of technological capabilities that this has happened. This is due to a human factor, and it seems that somebody wanted to also to not only create massive embarrassment but also massive damage. Needless to say, Saudi media has been completely silent and has tried to not draw attention to this. But anyone who's been in the know, obviously, has been made aware that this happened. And now, most likely, who would benefit from such a situation? State actors. And why is this so dangerous for everybody besides Saudi Arabia? Because the intelligence services cooperate with many of their counterparts around the world, including and especially the United States. So a lot of the sensitive information and possibly operations by Western partners of Saudi Arabia has been compromised, and quite frankly, anyone else who has such dealings should also consider a significant breach to their own external security processes, and should completely reevaluate and investigate their own data and their own operations, because uh, a breach of that sort is an absolute disaster. again, the fact that nobody is really talking about it besides this happening shows that, first of all, the media does not necessarily understand the value of these situations. Second, everybody involved quite deliberately is trying not to draw attention to it, because why give away, even more information that, instead of trying to contain the damage as much as possible. And why are the hackers themselves not drawing attention to this thing? Because they don't need the whole public to know, because they're first trying to sell this off to people with money and people with professional interest in this, and so they don't need wide attention for the time being. I think it's a matter of time before this does become wider public knowledge and becomes a huge scandal. For now, I think everybody is trying to assess the damage, to mitigate the damage, and to figure out what to do.
Absolutely, Irina. So one thing comes to my mind is that is it only for profit? Some hackers somewhere, got all these details and wanting to make profit of it. Secondly, is there something more beyond this? Because in the last episode we talked about, that's some sort of a speculation that MBS might visit Washington DC maybe by the end of the year. How do these things correlate anywhere? Any external party beyond the profits could be involved in this.
I do think that there is a correlation in the sense of whoever it is assessing the level of US Saudi relations and trying to create a point when, on the one hand, everybody is distracted with other things, but on the other hand, there is a sensitive moment where they can strike and cause massive damage behind the scenes. From the sources I'm hearing, it may seem that this trip may not be very likely in the near future, at least not when it's planned. Possibly because US is distracted with so many other political issues that are much more urgent, and there's not necessarily an urgency. I don't know whether this incident has played any part in that decision making. I do know that it certainly won't help, um, and it certainly may not be a good time to have a high level visit in the middle of a major intelligence failure, even if that failure is not all that public, and even if governments and officials don't directly involve themselves in intelligence operations and cooperation. Still, I think that creates a sense of a potential threat, complicates relations, and uh, distracts from any positive objectives that are being pursued. Um, I don't think it's also the only incident related to this situation that's worth looking at, although it's by far the biggest. I think in general there seems to be a series of uncertainties. For instance, Saudi Arabia was counting on hosting the Trump-Putin summit. They were promised that spot when this was first considered, circa February and March of this year. Uh, the fact that they lost that opportunity is not necessarily a bad thing, given how unwell it went. But still, it is a loss of a diplomatic forum that has not been compensated by any other major hosting opportunities nearby. We have seen that prior to this summit, Zelensky and MBS have exchanged a phone call to advance bilateral relations. Curiously enough, just now Putin sent a note to the Crown Prince to discuss bilateral relations. I do not know the specifics, but it is possible that Putin is trying not to lose leverage to Ukraine, and also is pushing ahead to consolidate his own influence in Saudi Arabia in light of tensions with the United States in an impasse regarding the Ukraine situation. We have also
Uh,
seen another incident that has not been highlighted as much as it should, which is the visit of planned visit, at least, of various Saudi high-level people to Russia, and investments, growing investments to the energy sector, and also the fact that Russia is being pushed as a travel destination for various Saudi and other Gulf travelers. All of these things combined point to the fact that some part of Saudi and Gulf societies is growing closer to Russia. UAE, I would say, and Qatar are probably the two closest, visibly closest countries. Oman has, while Iran has ongoing relations behind the scenes, but in Saudi Arabia it's also a growing situation, and of course Russians also present even in Bahrain. They are looking towards the Gulf as a gold mine in terms of BRICS cooperation, in terms of uh, uh, damaging U.S. relations in the Middle East, in terms of sheer financial profit, many other things. So now there's also a push to build popular relations to attract Russia as a destination and to build up this propagandistic image and an alternative to better known travel destinations, Seychelles or Maldives or European countries that the Gulf people like to travel to. So we are seeing this concerted effort by Russia to court Gulf states in general and Saudi Arabia especially. One of the factors, of course, is a close oil-related cooperation at the moment. Uh, this relationship over energy has not always been smooth. Saudi Arabia and Russia have often been competitors. Saudi Arabia in the past, during Trump's first term, has been very close to the US and coordinated economic warfare strategy against Russia regarding prices. But we're seeing that for now, Saudis are cooperating with Russia a lot more than they are with the United States with respect to this energy because their own interests are being damaged by US aggressive push in the energy realm, and so they find it more convenient to coordinate with other stakeholders from OPEC in that regard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our last topic of the day, Irina, is about Japan boosting its ties with African countries. How should we understand? Isn't Japan's hands already full with things around it, and what is it aiming to do here?
Well, Japan is in a precarious situation because it too has been significantly victimized by the US tariffs. Maybe not to the same extent as India, which has the highest tariff rate in Asia, but still significantly enough to be doing damage to both the economic relations with the US and to its own economy. So it needs to find alternatives. It has already agreed to a trilateral trade pact with China and South Korea, which is a major change from its previous, much more hawkish positions. But still, it's not enough. It's growing relations with India, growing relations with the Gulf states. But Africa seems to be a natural area for expanding its outreach, especially in light of competition by China in that regard. Japan is not at a stage where it can replace China in Africa, but it is trying to build up its network there, its relations, and possibly challenge China, or at least offset China influence in some regard that's favorable to its own interests. Let's not forget that many African countries have growing economies, highly engaged youth, and increasingly educated youth population, and entrepreneurial startups, and also natural resources that China would otherwise dominate. All of that makes African countries attracted to Japan, as it's facing an increasingly confused situation regards U.S. commitments, whether on the economic or on defense trajectories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.